On an unusually quiet White House morning, President Donald Trump was scanning Veterans Affairs reports when an aide entered with a weather-worn brown paper package bearing no return address, only the inscription, "To the President," from a proud Navy man. Trump lifted an eyebrow and asked its origin. The aide said a courier had dropped it off late the previous night. Inside lay a neatly penned note. "If you're reading this, I've already left this world, but I've carried something for decades that belongs in your hands. My name is Commander Franklin Pierce, and this is my last mission." Setting. The letter aside, Trump grew uncharacteristically silent as a sudden gravity filled the room. Cameras were already rolling for a small veterans event, yet instead of waiting, he chose to open the mysterious box on air. Advisors urged caution, but he waved them off, determined to break the seal immediately, if only to honor whatever final duty the late commander had entrusted to him. "This man served our country. I'll give him his moment," Trump said as the room fell silent, and he carefully cut the string around the package, the tension thickening with each slice until even the reporters stopped speaking. Inside was a neatly folded, worn American flag resting atop something wrapped in cloth. Trump paused as a journalist quietly wondered why a Navy veteran would send this now, but no one could guess what lay beneath. What was certain was this wasn't just a gift. It was a story about to unfold. Trump gently lifted the flag to reveal a velvet cloth, which he slowly unfolded to find a faded Navy medal, a weathered photo of a young man in uniform beside a woman and a baby, and a sealed envelope marked "To be opened in the presence of veterans." The silence grew heavier as Trump scanned the room. A few Navy veterans were present, and one stood with hat in hand, his voice shaking. "That's Commander Franklin Pierce. He served in Vietnam." Another whispered, "A legend." "I haven't heard that name in 30 years, the elderly veteran murmured as Trump studied the photo again, the young man's eyes full of hope, the woman beside him glowing with pride, and the baby in her arms no older than 6 months. "What do you think this is?" Trump asked the veterans, and the oldest among them, 79-year-old Captain Roy Jenkins, stepped forward. "If Frank sent that, he's asking you to tell a story most of us buried." Trump paused, then nodded. "Let's open the letter together." As he broke the seal, the scent of aged paper filled the room. The letter, handwritten with no date or address, was raw emotion in neat cursive. "Mr. President, I've carried regret for over 5 decades. What lies in this box was never mine to keep. It was my burden and my redemption. Please share it with the world. It's time they know the truth, especially my daughter." Gasps rippled through the room. Trump looked up, his voice solemn. "He had a daughter," Jenkins nodded. "Frank never saw her again after the war." The story was just beginning, and Trump carefully unfolded the rest of the letter, his voice steady as he continued reading. The words weren't from a politician or general, but from a father, a man who had carried a silent burden for decades. "I was a proud Navy pilot in Vietnam. One mission went wrong. My co-pilot died in my arms, and I crash-landed in a jungle where villagers hid me for 6 months. When I returned, my world had moved on. My wife, my daughter, they were gone. I didn't know where or why." Trump paused, as emotion thickened in the room. "I kept this medal, the flag, and this photo as both punishment and memory. I never reached out. I thought it would hurt them more, but I never stopped loving her." Trump's voice cracked slightly and even hardened. Reporters lowered their cameras. "Now I leave my truth behind. Tell her she deserves to know." That night, Trump sat in the Oval Office, the photo and letter still in hand, unable to stop staring at the young Navy pilot holding the child he never saw again. "I need to find her," Trump said to his aides. "No press, no spectacle, just answers." Within hours, the team began digging, old records, military files, phone calls to retired officers, until they traced the wife, Elaine Carter, who had since remarried in the late 70s. She had passed away, 1992, his aide reported. But her daughter's name was Clara Rose Pierce, later changed to Clara Morgan. Trump leaned forward. "Where is she now?" "She's a history teacher in Asheville, North Carolina." Trump looked at the photo again, a small smile tugging at his lips. She's teaching the very past her father lived through. We have to tell her. Despite concerns from staff, Trump made a surprising call. No media, no cameras, no press release. Just 2 agents and me. The plan was simple. Arrive quietly at Clara Morgan's school under the guise of a veteran's education visit. The principal only knew a federal guest was coming. Clara had no clue. She stood in front of her 7th grade history class, explaining the complexities of the Vietnam War. Some veterans came home to cheers, she said. Some came home to silence. Others came home to ghosts. The classroom door opened. Silence. Clara turned and saw the President of the United States walk in, holding a small wooden box and an old photo. "You're Clara Morgan?" he asked. She nodded, confused. "I believe this belongs to you," he said gently, placing the box in her hands. Her breath caught. The past had just arrived, unannounced. She unfolded her father's letter and read, slowly each word peeling back decades of doubt. "I never stopped looking for you, Clara. I thought you'd moved on. I lived with the guilt of leaving and never forgiving myself." Her eyes welled up. "I thought he left us. I thought he didn't care." Trump nodded. "He didn't abandon you. He just didn't know how to come back." Clara stared at the medal lying gently in the box. "I used to dream about him, flying through clouds, writing me letters he never sent." She finally held one. Outside, curious students pressed against the glass. "Why send this to you?" she asked. Trump offered a small smile. "Because he knew I'd find you, and he believed your story deserved to be heard, with honor." She looked up. "Then let's tell it together." The next morning, Clara stood before her class. No textbooks, no whiteboard, just her father's folded flag, his faded photo, and the medal in her hands. "This," she began softly, "isn't just a Navy medal. It's a story. It's my story." Her students leaned in, many seeing her cry for the first time. "My father flew combat missions in Vietnam. He was declared missing in action for 6 months. By the time he came home, my mother and I had moved on, or at least that's what he believed." She paused, voice shaking. "He didn't abandon us. He was just too late, and then he couldn't find us, so he lived quietly, carrying this photo and a heart full of regret," Clara said, holding up the letter. "And now I finally know. He never stopped loving me." Her students were silent, understanding this lesson wasn't in any textbook. Back on Air Force One, Trump sat alone, staring out the window as clouds rolled by. The once heavy box now lay empty beside him. The flag had found its home, the medal rested with a daughter, and the letter had finally been read. He thought of the things people leave unsaid, the truths buried over time. That box had held more than mementos. It had carried the soul of a man. A Secret Service agent approached quietly. "Sir, we're landing soon." Trump nodded silently, glancing once more at the creased photo worn from Clara's hands. "He was just trying to be remembered," Trump murmured. And in doing so, the late commander had reminded everyone, presidents included, that real courage often comes in quiet, forms regret, forgiveness, and a handwritten letter that arrived just in time. News spread fast in Asheville after Clara shared the story during a school assembly. Parents, students, and teachers gathered in stillness as she raised her father's medal and told them what had happened. The story went viral, with headlines reading, "President delivers final words of missing Navy hero." Pilot to daughter, veterans groups across the country began sharing tributes to Commander Franklin Pierce, many astonished that the president had come without cameras. Clara confirmed it. He wasn't there as a politician, but as a man delivering a message. The local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall hosted a memorial, where Clara, for the first time, stood before rows of decorated uniforms, not as a teacher, but as the daughter of a forgotten hero. When she finished speaking, many of those veterans stood and saluted, not to Trump, but to her father. That night, Clara sat at her kitchen table and wrote a letter, not for publicity, but from the heart. "Dear Mr. President, you didn't have to find me and you didn't have to care, but you did. Because of you, I finally know my father. I didn't just get a box, I got peace. Thank you for giving me my history back and for honoring my father like he mattered." She folded it, placed it in an envelope, and set it aside, not knowing if it would ever reach him, but knowing she had said what needed to be said while she still could. Sometimes that's all that matters. The greatest healing doesn't come from knowing every detail, but from finally being seen and heard. 2 weeks later, Clara returned to her father's hometown in Ohio, carrying the medal and flag. She visited the small cemetery where her grandparents rested, and the empty plot beside them was now marked for a man who never came home but would never be forgotten. A local stonecutter donated a granite plaque that read, "Commander Franklin Pierce, Navy pilot, hero, father, lost but never forgotten." Clara gently placed the medal by the marker and tucked a laminated copy of the letter beneath the flag. As she stepped back, a breeze rustled through the trees. She was no longer alone. The town, the history, and the truth had come full circle. This was no longer just her father's story, it was hers too. Soon, emails, letters, and calls flooded Clara's school. Vietnam veterans who had served with her father reached out, some having flown or trained alongside him. "He never stopped talking about his wife and baby girl," one message read, while another man in his 80s shared, "He carried that photo like it was stitched into his flight suit on every mission and briefing." Clara printed each message she received and placed them in a binder she called My Father's Voice. She also heard from children of other soldiers who, like her, had grown up without the full truth. They thanked her for sharing her story, and some even invited her to speak at their schools. Her father's letter hadn't just healed her. It had opened wounds in others and started to heal them too. Sometimes one story is enough to make thousands feel less alone. Clara's story transformed her school in unexpected ways. Students began interviewing grandparents about military service. Teachers created a wall of service filled with photos and names of relatives who had served, and history came alive. At a school assembly, a shy student stood up and said, "My dad never talks about Iraq, but after hearing Ms. Morgan's story, he finally told me he was scared every night." The room went silent and another student whispered, "Same with my mom. She was a Navy medic." Veterans Day became more meaningful than ever. More than just an assembly, Veterans Day became deeply personal. Clara stood at the back, watching the ripple of emotion she never meant to start. All she did was open a box, and suddenly, the past rushed into the present, building something new. Understanding, respect, and the realization that no story is ever too late to be told. Meanwhile, far from Washington, Samuel Marks, a 78-year-old retired craftsman, watched the news and froze when he recognized the box. It was the hand-carved walnut box he made years ago, commissioned by Franklin Pierce. "I want it to last." Franklin had told him back then. Samuel had long forgotten the job until now. He wrote a short letter to Clara. "Your father was a quiet man with tired eyes. This box holds his story. I never thought I'd live to see it opened." Clara called him, and they spoke for an hour about woodwork and the man they both remembered, for very different reasons. Some legacies are carved in stone, others in walnut, sealed with the weight of what was never said until now. One morning, Clara found an envelope in her mailbox bearing the presidential seal. Inside was a single-page note. "Clara, your letter moved me more than you know. In this job we often carry burdens for strangers, but your story stayed with me. Thank you for teaching me that silence is not the end, and that some of the loudest voices come from the quietest people. Your father was a hero, but more importantly, he was yours. With respect and admiration, Donald J. Trump." Clara smiled softly. She hadn't expected a reply, but it reminded her that sometimes true leadership is shown not in speeches, but in what's done when no one is watching. By delivering that box, he had delivered closure, and that made all the difference. Clara began collecting letters, photos, veteran messages, and news clippings. What started as a personal keepsake soon became something bigger when a small publisher asked, "Would you consider turning this into a book?" She hesitated, saying, "It's not about me," but the editor smiled and replied, "Exactly, it's about everyone." She titled it The Box Heft. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. Its story found its way into libraries, military bases, and classrooms. Letters poured in from children, veterans, and widows who had held on to silence. 4 years. One letter read, "I finally forgave my father after reading your book. Thank you." Clara realized she was no longer just telling her father's story. She was helping others tell their own. At the next Veterans Day assembly, Clara placed her father's folded flag on an empty chair at center stage. "This chair," she said, into the microphone, "is for all the men and women whose stories were never told, for those who came home but left pieces of themselves behind." Students stood, some wept. The empty chair spoke louder than any speech could. Later, an elderly man with trembling hands approached her, whispering, "I lost my brother in Vietnam. I never cried for him until today." Clara said nothing, just hugged him, knowing healing isn't always closure. It's being seen, heard, and leaving space. That chair was for grief that needed a place to rest. Months later, Clara was invited to a private wreath-laying ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Trump attended quietly, without press or photographers, standing beside her as they placed a wreath near the tomb of the unknown soldier. Clara held her father's flag close while Trump leaned in and softly said, "He would have been proud." She nodded, whispering, "He already was, I just didn't know it." As they parted, Trump handed her a small card with 4 words. "You gave him home." In that sacred, silent place where so many had sacrificed all, a daughter and a president shared a rare moment, not of politics or power, but of peace. Before the school year ended, Clara wrote one last letter, not to the president or her students, but to her father. She placed it inside the now empty walnut box. "Dad, I understand now. The silence wasn't because you didn't care. It was because you didn't know how to come back. But you tried. You kept my photo, my name, my memory. Now I'll carry yours. Love always, your daughter, Clara." She sealed the box, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it on a shelf behind her desk. Not as a relic, but as a reminder that some stories take decades to end, and some broken hearts can still be made whole. Months later, Trump shared the story during a Veterans Group speech, holding up the photo Franklin Pierce had mailed him. "This box," he said, "was never meant to make headlines. It was meant to carry a truth buried for 50 years. Pausing, his voice lowered. "When I opened it, the room went quiet, but in that silence I heard everything: regret, love, sacrifice, and forgiveness." The crowd fell silent again, then rose in a slow, respectful ovation. The story of one forgotten veteran had touched millions.